I have a question for all of you. What's your favorite scary movie? In this series, we've talked a lot about several events that have been converted into films. Obviously, this has been nothing new. This has been going on since the 1960s, even possibly even further than that, where films sensationalized the Jack the Ripper murders. We've seen this before with several movie directors and producers in film studios making movies out of mass murders, out of tragedies. I speak, of course, of such things as of the movie franchise that spawned from the Crystal Lake killings, loosely based off of each killing, might I add. The Elm Street murders, and of course, the infamous Texas Chainsaw Massacres. But the killings I am going to talk about today, the first killings, I should say, have been going on now for 30 years. And these are inspired by those very films. I'm speaking, of course, of the Woodsboro murders, the Ghostface killings, as they're also known as. Today, we will be discussing the first Ghostface killings of Woodsboro. This tale, as the others before it, is one of violence and darkness. So if you wish not to subject your nerves to such a strain, now's your chance to, well, we warned you. Our story takes place in Woodsboro, California. Simple town. Simple, not too very far away in Northern California, far from LA and far from many major metropolitan areas of Southern California. And for all intents and purposes, this was a quiet little village. Nothing too serious, nothing major, until 1996, when one night it set off a chain of events that would forever make Woodsboro synonymous with murder. The first murders that occurred were on one night, one summer night, at the home of Casey Becker. Casey Becker, as you can see here in this photo of her taken by her mother, Casey Becker was all intents and purposes she was a popular girl at Woodsboro High. Everyone seemed to like her. She was very kind, very funny, according to her surviving friends, I should say. And it's odd that the murderers, of course, you would know those murderers by now, but we'll get to them in a bit. It's odd that they chose Casey Becker as the first target of their rampage. Now, Casey Becker received a phone call at around 9:30. In that phone call, it was an anonymous phone call of a unknown figure asking what her favorite movie was. At first, Casey assumed that it was nothing more than crank calling or just a wrong number and hung up. However, the calls kept coming, and they became more and more aggressive, more violent. It wasn't until the caller on the other end forced Casey to stay on the line for the sake of her boyfriend's life, Steve Orth. Now, Orth was a football player and the love of Casey's life. However, the killers, the Ghostface assailants, had captured Orth while he was on his way to see Casey while her parents were out, tied him up and set him on the patio where they played a game of horror movie knowledge. According to some speculation, Casey got the wrong answer on one of the questions, and that led to Orth being gutted and stabbed repeatedly in the chest. Casey now was in fear of her life, and the assailants broke into her home, where she managed to, according to police records, after doing an investigation of the home, it did look like that Casey did manage to struggle and free herself from being killed in her house. Sadly, however, she was murdered. When her parents were just only a minute from home, she raced to their car, but the killer managed to chase her down and stab her repeatedly, according to autopsy reports, several times in the chest and back, and at least three times in the stomach. But the killer was not done. The killer left Becker's body strung up against a tree for her parents to see. Casey was the first, and she will not be the last of these murders. Now, to properly tell this story, I must tell the story of another person. That being Sidney Prescott, her photo shown here. Sidney Prescott was the, I guess you could say, the oddball of the Woodsboro High. Not really a popular girl, but not disliked either. Although she did carry a stigma around Woodsboro itself after her mother was raped and murdered by, allegedly, Cotton Weary. Now, she did have friends. She did have a support group, one of whom was Casey Becker. Of course, the news rocked Sydney's life as well as her friend group. The friends in question were that of Tatum Riley, the younger sister of Dewey Riley, the sheriff of the town, Stu Mocker, who I'm sure that name will come up more. You also have, it's funny, I apologize for laughing, but knowing what we know about everything that happened 30 years ago, it's funny to name these names, such as Stu Mocker and, of course, the other person I'll get to in a moment. And the other friend was a movie enthusiast by the name of Randy Meeks. But I urge you that we need to talk about Billy Loomis. Billy Loomis was the at the time ex-girlfriend of Sidney Prescott. The two had become estranged, and they had grown apart as of late. Billy was always called I guess you could say, the odd man out because of his father and his dealings. Now, Billy, what we know now, planned this as a long game, and I do stress long game. And I suppose it's no use to get a beat around the bush. He is one of the two Ghostface killers. In fact, he is one of the two first Ghostface killers. I say first because, as opposed to the alleged, the Michael Myers murders, the alleged single Jason Voorhees killer, and the Leatherface killer of Texas, the Ghostface killer is one that's almost treated as a title. It's taken on by multiple assailants. And we've seen that throughout nearly 30 years. Here's a picture of a replica of the Ghostface costume, not from the killings, but from the stab movies that were inspired from the Woodsboro murders. As you can see, it's a cheap Halloween costume that anyone can get. And the hunting knife is something you can buy at any supermarket, really. What I find personally interesting about the first Ghostface killings is how simplistic it all almost feels, in the fact that there is something that feels almost natural. It feels, as opposed to the other killings I've talked about, the Cabrini Green killer, the the strange occurrences that happened with Lucy Westrina, and of course the Invisible Man of Iping. It's almost welcoming to see a regular serial killer. I have to be on. I know it's macabre to say, but it's fascinating that this is probably the most natural killings I've encountered so far in my episodes. Getting back on topic, the following days after Casey Becker's murder, this basically led to Woodsboro becoming ground zero. And it was also unfortunate to note that either Stu or Billy, we don't know which, and I will get more into that as to why it's a little odd to say who can be who. The principal was murdered by either Stu or Billy. This led to the school being closed and also the story being picked up by one Gail Weathers. Gail, as I'm sure you've known, is a touchy subject for many a people. I have to be honest. Gail is also a bit of is someone I would consider an acquired taste, if one was to say. The whole thing of Gail is that it was almost borderline opportunistic, and she didn't have the best relations to begin with Sidney Prescott, because she covered her mother's death in a very tasteless way, shall we say. I also have to point out that Gail herself admitted that this was a story that would probably get her awards and fame. She was chasing another white whale after the events with Sidney. To be honest, I don't feel bad when Sidney Prescott punched her in the face. Allegedly, there is no footage of that. Though I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to see that moment. Now, among the now let's actually talk about Dewey Riley. Dewey Riley, as I said, was the sheriff of Woodsboro at the time. Dewey was the definition of a small town cop. He had grown up here. He had lived here. He was clearly not ready for the level of murder and mayhem that Stu Macher and Billy Loomis were unleashing at the point. He had encountered murders before, obviously with, Sidney's death, but he was clearly unqualified to follow up on these murders. He had never encountered anything for it, which is funny to say looking back, because how intrinsically tied he is to the other 5 Ghostface murders until his unfortunate own death that occurred several years ago, as I'm sure all of you are aware. Now, as I said, it's difficult to say where Stu and where Billy began. It was very clear that the two were tag teaming to keep suspicion off, which is funny because they were talking about, during conversations, according to some memoirs by Sidney Prescott, that Stu and Billy also talked about how were they the murderer or not. They would even start these conversations. And it's very clear that they were inspired by horror movies. This also led to some people suspecting Randy Meeks as almost like a third killer. Randy Meeks is another interesting fellow in here. He was a survivor of the first Woodsboro killings, as he's seen here in this photograph, in the middle between Stu and Billy. It's almost funny in a cosmic sort of way that he was face to face with both killers. Now, Randy Meeks considered this all like he saw Billy and Stu's game as a horror movie. He clearly saw the motive. And while he couldn't tell, he didn't know that Billy and Stu were the killers. He clearly understood what game they were playing. And that has saved people's lives to this day. Even his niece and nephew have managed to save lives in the recent several killings. I'm sure you're aware of the fifth Woodsboro attack, Ghostface murders, and the sixth that occurred in New York. But one day, I swear, dear listener, we will speak of those murders another time, but let's focus on the here and now. As horror movie fanatics, Billy and Stu played this entire game like a horror movie. They were obsessed with playing by the rules. Even Billy taking Sidney Prescott's virginity one night during a party. This is a picture of the party at Stu's house, at Stu Macher's very house, which stands, by the way, to this very day as an Airbnb, if you can believe it. This is the house as it stands now. There has been renovations, but yes, this is the very same house. Now, the motive for Billy and Stu's murder, their killings were spurred on by the destruction of Billy's own family caused by Sidney Prescott, her mother, who had an affair with the Loomis family. This led Billy to concoct a long-term revenge against his own girlfriend. Stu Macher was allowed in on it because he loved the thrill of these killings. He wanted the fame, which is, again, it's funny to bring that up because some of these killers in other Ghostface murders also wanted fame from such atrocities. The other victims I should speak of was unfortunately was Dewey's own sister, Tatum, who was brutally murdered in the garage of her own of a house. She did, by the investigation and of the crime scene, it was clear that Tatum did try to put up a fight, and that's another thing I would like to bring up to discuss. You see, unlike Michael Myers or other prolific serial killers like Horace Pickner or the Leatherface killer or the Springwood slasher Freddy Krueger before his execution, all of them had a proficiency. All of them it was like a machine. All of them did their work as if it came as second nature to them. Billy and Stu, for lack of a better word, were amateurs. There have been multiple reports of not just them, but many of the Ghostface killers not being great at murder. And that's a very dark thing to say, but it's true when you compare them to other such killers like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, the Springwood slasher. All of them did their work like it was second nature to them, like it was just easy for them to go and murder. Billy and Stu, while they had a very solid plan in theory, executing, and it's an odd word to say right there, executing these murders, such as like on Tatum, and even Casey Becker was borderline luck because they were able to catch her, But for the most part, Billy and Stu would fall over themselves. It was reported that they would trip, they would fall. Many of them would hit their heads on objects. Now, that could be because the Ghostface costume while it is striking and imposing, it's also rather flimsy. It's easy to trip on the fabric that makes the cloak, or have very little visibility in the Ghostface mask. So I can understand why Sidney was able to survive for as long as she has, with the effects of just from the killers not having the best visibility or mobility to catch their prey most of the time. Now, as we cycle back to the Stu Macher house, it was all coming to a head. The group had been watching horror movies all night, and Billy had taken Sydney's virginity as, again, there was a reason for that, and I don't mean to be crass, but again, Billy was enacting like this was all a horror movie. He wanted to treat this like a horror movie down to the very end of the final girl being a virgin who can't be killed. She's meant to be pure, as according to Randy Meeks. His head, he had made her not so much as the but as another girl to be slaughtered like a lamb. Now, several more murders occurred in the house. Even Gale's film crew, had been killed off during these attacks. This culminated into Billy and Stu confronting Sydney, they had also kidnapped her father for a massive revenge murder plot. It's unknown and unclear, even by Sydney in her memoirs, doesn't go into much detail about it. But what she does do, or what she has said, is that she managed to free herself. This led to her fighting through Stu and Billy until eventually it culminated in Sydney shooting Billy in the head, killing him. This ended the first Woodsboro murders. But as I said, these were the first Woodsboro murders. They were not the last. And they were certainly not relegated in some cases to Woodsboro. And what of Stu Macher? Notice how I mentioned that while Stu was caught in the conflict, his body was never found. Some say that Stu Macher still lives to this day in a psychiatric ward. But it is impossible to say, dear viewer. It is very impossible to say that. So what can we learn? What can we discern from the first Woodsboro killings? Are they the work of some macabre revenge story? Yes. But some people have blamed horror movies and the horror genre itself for inspiring Stu Macher and Billy Loomis and some of the other Ghostface murderers. And again, dear viewer, we will talk about those murders in the near future, sometime in the near future. But it's hard to say. I feel personally, and I'm going to go into more of a personal feel of it, I thoroughly believe that Stu and Billy were not inspired by these horror movies. They used it as an excuse. And I've seen this too many times of so many people blaming horror movies when the real issue is sometimes people are just evil. I thoroughly am convinced that even if they weren't horror movie fans, Stu Macher and Billy Loomis would have concocted some sort of murder scheme to kill Sidney Prescott and her friends. That revenge plan had nothing to do with horror movies. It was just it was a revenge plan that was made into a scene of theatrics, if you ask me. There was nothing that is an excuse, in my opinion. It was said that Stu Macher once said, "Movies don't make psychopaths. Movies give psychopaths good ideas." I don't believe that's true either. I believe it's just weak men hiding behind an excuse, and that's all it is. Now, do horror movies cause a negative effect? It's hard to say. I'm not the right person to go too deep into it, but again, if you ask me, I thoroughly believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that even if they were not horror movie fans, even if they didn't talk to Randy Meeks at all, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher still would have done something like this. Maybe not to the level of putting on a Ghostface costume. They would have done something. they would have done something maybe even more horrendous. It's a possibility. I'm not defending the idea of making them putting on masks and becoming, as some serial killers that are called slashers. I don't believe that at all. I do believe, however, that they had a goal, they had targets in mind, and they didn't care who they hurt. And they didn't care what families they destroyed. They didn't care about any of it. All they cared about was hurting Sidney Prescott. And in doing so, they decimated so many lives. And and not only that, they basically created a monster that will never die with the Ghostface killers. It will never end because of them. And a warped sense of justice. That is all it is two kids who had a warped sense of justice. One of them thought it was fun. The other one wanted to inflict pain on a person he's supposed to love. It's just evil. Simply put, it is just unbridled, unmitigated fucking evil. And that's all it is. The Woodsboro murders were supposed to end after Billy Loomis was executed by Sidney Prescott, who was exonerated for killing Billy. She was exonerated of it, and it was called self-defense. A rarity, actually, in the state of California. They do see murder as murder, the last I checked. But that would not be the end. It's even believed that to this day, people will put on the Ghostface mask and hunt down Sidney Prescott. I don't know where she is now, but I pray that she found some peace in her life. That is all I ask, is that poor woman who suffered for 30 years. She has suffered for 30 years, that she finds peace in her life. But we will talk, as I've been saying, we will talk about the other Ghostface murders later on down the road. So, dear listener, the next time you hear your phone ring and you don't know who the caller is, maybe just let it go to voicemail next time. Until next time, dear viewer, this has been I am Mr. Multiverse. And until we meet again, here's to a world of gods and monsters.